that's where people get really alarmed if, let's say, they have a Whoop band or Apple Watch and they get a readiness score and their readiness score is pretty low and they're in the red. They freak out, but it's like, no, that's what's going to happen. Like you're putting in a lot of work. There's a lot of volume. It's high intensity. This is the time that we want you to be in the red. Like you'll get out of the red, but right now it's the high intensity work. You have to kind of push that envelope a bit. It gets a bit sketchy when we're seeing like other symptoms, like someone getting sick and all that, then say, okay, we went a little bit over.
The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all one place, zorfitness.com.
I cracked a cold one. Yeah.
Cold fitting.
I used to like chug my like energy drinks, like a Ghost energy would be gone in like 2 minutes.
You're a Ghost
that can is, yeah.
person.
They're good, yeah. But like as of lately, I've just been like a sipper now. I don't know what changed, why it changed, but like it'll last me. Like, let's say I start having one at like 7 a.m. It'll last me until like 2 p.m. I'll just like sip on it.
I think I'd rather have you be the chug person because I can't even, like, it has to be completely flat and so warm by the time you're drinking it at 2 p.m.
It like stays like carbonated. It's pretty good with that. It's pretty crazy.
Like, I've done this before where I've drank like a seltzer before bed and then like sat it like on like my nightstand or something, and then you just hear it going like hear the bubbles popping, and it can drive me nuts if I do that.
Oh yeah, especially because like seltzers are so aggressive. Like sometimes like when you pop one open, like it kind of hurts to drink it. It's like so aggressive. And you're just like, oh fuck, I wasn't expecting that.
So we did a beer mile here last Black Friday, and I wanted to practice, but I was like, I'm not drinking like 4 beers in like a Wednesday at 4 p.m. while I'm practicing this thing. So I did it with seltzers, and it was arguably harder with seltzers.
Honestly, I could see that.
Like Wegmans, like I forget what it was, like orange or something. Seltzers, it was so gross.
Yeah.
They're so carbonated. It was like more carbonated than beer when I did that.
Yeah, they're aggressive. It's like because I get a lot of like diet Sprites and stuff like that. Diet Sprite, and then other drinks like that. But like Sprite especially, that one's tough. That one's I gotta like prepare myself. I'm like.
So I've given Jax seltzers before, and he'll be like, spicy.
Spicy.
He thinks they're spicy. Like, to him, that's what spicy is. It just means that it's carbonated. Oh, boy. So today we're not just going to talk about seltzers and ghosts.
No.
We're going to talk about training because that's what we signed up to do here. So, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of curious because there's, I think, you know, obviously a number of things that you do really well as a coach. One of them being kind of like gathering data from athletes and using that in a pretty objective way. I think you've said before that you're a pretty boring programmer, but in a lot of ways that just means that it's like there's more things that are controlled variables, which is helpful a lot of times in training because there's already so much that's varying day to day for people. So yeah, I'm kind of curious as to get some of your thoughts on how you use some of these metrics and things. You did a talk at camp. Do you remember what it was called exactly?
I don't remember the exact title. I just know it was basically me talking, like basically going on a 40-minute rant about data and just boring people to death about that. So that's all I remember. But I don't remember the exact title of it.
All right, there it is. Using data to navigate injury barriers, episode 144, if people want to go back and listen.
There we go.
So, yeah, I mean, honestly, that was really insightful. I encourage people to go listen to that if they haven't heard that, or even if they have. I mean, there was a lot of people at camp who they kind of found what you were saying interesting, but some of it probably went over their heads. Some of it probably went over my head. So I also think it'll be helpful for us to maybe double click on that and expand a little bit. So I guess first of all, let's lay a little bit of foundation. Like what do you typically track with? Let's go with CrossFit athletes first.
Yeah, with CrossFit athletes, most of them, not all of them. Actually, I work with them remotely, so I don't have access to a lot of things, but basically wearable technology and their own subjective perspectives on things. So those are the two measurements, or those are the two tools I use. So with the wearable technology, most CrossFit athletes have something like either Apple Watch or a Whoop. And so I like to track HRV, heart rate variability, as well as resting heart rate. So those are the two main ones. And then with that, I like to get a subjective input from the athlete themselves. And that comes in daily on their, basically their Excel sheet. I just have them ask like how difficult the session was so that I can get perspective on that. How much sleep they've got, and that's not really objective. That's not really subjective, that is objective. And that you could get that if you have Whoop, it'll give you the exact amount, or if you just basically know what time you fell asleep and what time you woke up. So those, that, and then on a weekly check-in, I ask basically how they're feeling, mental stress, physical stress, and basically it's all subjective. How are you feeling, roundup of the week, so I can see where they're at.
Mm-hmm. If you had to pick one or the other, which one did you pick?
Versus objective or subjective? Or yeah. I think in this case where we are now with technology, there's still a lot of room for improvement, and I think subjective is the way to go. So even if someone didn't have a Whoop or anything, that's fine. I think of subjective measurements is always king or queen to everything.
Yeah, I would probably agree. I'm not as sciencey as you, but yeah, it's I don't know. There's probably just some things that are maybe a little bit intangible, and maybe some of that's just like psychology, and probably ultimately you could tie someone's psychology back to hormones or neurotransmitters and things, and get into the science side of it, but those aren't all things that are being tracked and like quantified really well, like you said at this point. So certainly technology could probably get there where it's like not only just like a broad marker of like readiness or stress state or things like that, but can be a little bit more specific as to like what types of training someone will actually be able to handle well. Whereas like most people, if they walk in, they can just tell you that stuff just because they just feel. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And then to add on to that, like it's like you were saying, most people can tell you, like most of the time if I'm feeling sick, like every day from the times that I've gotten sick over the past 2 years when I've had my Whoop tells me, oh, hey, you're basically sick. You're at a 4% recovery. And meanwhile, I'm throwing up on the toilet. Like, yes, I'm aware of that. Like, it's like, so it's kind of like, okay, it's cool. It confirms it. Thank you for letting me know. But it's like most of the time the body knows, and the person is most of the time in tune with their body. So they can tell you if they feel like trash.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like wow, right now, thanks. Like the toddler version. Like that's something that my son would do. Would be like come up to you and you're like puking, like, you're sick.
Yeah.
Yeah, buddy, I am. Thank you.
Thank
as
you.
If I didn't already know. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Whoop. Didn't know I was already messed up. Yeah. So, how reactive are you to, say you get somebody's HRV and it's uncharacteristically low? Are you gonna pull their training away? Normally change their training? How much might you alter it? Do you always alter it? What's that typically look like?
Yeah, I'm not super reactive to it initially. I think that's something I look at trends over time, so not from a day-to-day basis. So if someone had a hard training day and I programmed a hard training day, I expect the following day their resting heart rate and their HRV their resting heart rate will go up and their HRV will go down. That's expected, right? Their bodies, and now like we basically push them hard, put a lot of stress on their body. The body's going to respond with these stressed numbers reflecting stress. So that's as expected. So it's like, okay, cool. That's kind of what I want, right? Now, okay, I intended for you to have a hard training day, and you did. Perfect. If that's going on for periods of time where, let's say, over the week, I just see it trending down, it's like, okay, this person, I think I dug them, like they may have gotten dug into a hole, and now they're having a hard time coming out of that. Okay, now let's respond to that. It's looking at it, I would say, in a weekly trend is how I look at it, and monthly trend as well over time. If I'm seeing their resting heart rate, let's say, was around 50, which is pretty good, and then it's slowly creeping up, and let's say like 3 months later, it's now at 60, and it's averaging at 60 consistently, that's an issue. We got to address that. So from on a day-to-day basis, not really reactive. It's just more informative over time, trends, weekly, monthly. That's where things, that's where I'll take action.
Yeah. I feel like I've had a conversation with Chris at some point about this, because we both do a similar thing where it's like, even if, I don't know if Chris collects HRV, for example. I do for the people that have it, but even still, like if it's, low on one particular day, I like, they just slept bad. They're, dog had to go poop 6 times in the middle of the night, or they have kids up, or who knows what, right? Life stuff. And sometimes it's, you just chalk it up to like especially in CrossFit, sometimes it's like there's a lot of factors and sometimes it's hard to predict. But then if you do see like a trend consistently where it's like, man, every time we get to Wednesday and this is their third, high session in a row, they just tend to not produce much, not feel like they can produce much force, and just like all their strength numbers are just really high exertion to get to their percentages on that day. It's like you do that for 3-4 weeks in a row and you realize, okay, this is just not going well. Like it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. And then it's like the numbers are also backing up that gut feeling that I already have as a coach. And that way it's like a way to reinforce what I'm doing. And then I can also present that to the athlete as sort of almost like arguing my case as to like why we need to be adjusting training, if that makes sense.
Right. And yeah, exactly. It gives you that information. Like I think one of the jobs as a coach is like one of the most important things is realizing these patterns, right? Like, okay, this is how, I wanted them to have 2 high days and a moderate back to a high. And then you realize they consistently are not able to meet the intent of the high day. They're not hitting percentages and all that. Then it's like, oh, that makes sense. Now that I look at these numbers, it shows me that it's just their body's wrecked. It needs more recovery time. Everyone has a different recovery time. And like, I've seen it all across the board. Like I personally have a slow recovery time. I know by the end of the week, I'm pretty like the volume accumulation.
If you slept till 8 a.m., you wouldn't.
Yeah, maybe that would be a different story. Though I'm not gonna go into that one. Yeah, and then other people where they're able to recover really fast and they're able to take those repeated bouts of high intensity.
Yeah. Maybe this depends on the time of year, but generally, like, how willing are you to let people overreach, where it's like you see lower HRV, which again generally means less recovered. You see higher resting heart rates, again generally meaning less recovered. And you see that, you're also kind of like, okay, we're building volume during this time. Just making a scenario. It's like we're building volume, and I would expect you to be tired. Like how kind of far are you willing to dig in that direction?
Yeah, that definitely comes down to the athlete. It's very dependent on the athlete and conversations that we have. Like if they're really not feeling well and it's taking a toll on them mentally as well, then it's like, okay, we're going to need to back off, because, a lot of times people aren't the longevity of them in a certain sport is because they're not able to keep up consistency, or they get burned out. So, considering those things, burnout is a real thing. So that's where the subjective data comes in, and that comes through check-ins and also through conversations. There are other times if I am confident someone can handle the work and it's part of the process, like part of the process is you're going to kind of dig yourself in a hole for a bit and overreach, as long as I'm allowing eventually a recovery time where that super compensation effect can come in and they can recover and gain the rewards from their work.
Yeah. Yeah, I just went through a pretty intensive training phase myself, and yeah, I heard someone else say this on a different podcast, and it kind of resonated with me well, just because like I was going through that personally in my training. I was like, oh yeah, I'm seeing this. It's like, you can't try to, you know, you can only push the volume so far, and try to like you can't like push the athlete faster than they're ready to handle. In terms of like upping their volume. However, you can expect to have certain, like lagging effects from what you're doing because you are pushing yourself. So it's this sort of this sweet spot of like balancing, like you're going to have, undulating cycles and training where it's just, again, you're going to push certain qualities more at certain times. And there's other times where you're just going to be a little bit more beat up and tired from what you're doing. And as long as that doesn't kind of cross a certain threshold where the athlete is mentally in a bad spot or physically in a bad spot, that it takes them too long to recover, that you'll probably be okay.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where people get really alarmed if, let's say, they have a Whoop band or Apple Watch and they get a readiness score, and their readiness score is pretty low and they're in the red. Like, they freak out, but it's like, no, that's what's going to happen. Like, you're putting in a lot of work. There's a lot of volume. It's high intensity. This is the time that we want you to be in the red. Like, you'll get out of the red, but right now it's the high intensity work. You have to kind of push that envelope a bit. It gets a bit sketchy when we're seeing like maybe other symptoms like someone getting sick and all that, then say, okay, we went a little bit over. There's actually, I don't know if you're familiar with Cal Dietz.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he is a strength and conditioning coach, and he wrote the book for triphasic training. But one of the things, I think it was him who said it, but one of the things that he mentions is when he trained the hockey players and his athletes, like he would basically, towards the end of their training, if they were like getting sick, like getting a cold and all that, he's like, okay, we're heading in the right direction, because he's pushing them in that volume. I thought it was a little bit like, I'm like,
extreme.
oh, that's a little extreme, but I understood what he meant by it. And it's like there's going to be a lot of stressors during that time, and that's where you want to go in these certain phases of your training. So it's typical. Don't freak out when you're in the red or anything like that. But if you are getting sick, I do think that's an indicator to back off a little bit.
Yeah. I've Sam Hagen and Dante, when they were at Mekon Rush, we were all there together, and he was joking about how the competition feels like a deload because it's so much less volume than we do on a normal training weekend. And he was joking about it, but not at the same time, not really, only joking, like half joking.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think it's obviously like at a certain point in for like a CrossFitter, but like maybe this applies to any sport. Like you have to, that's capacity based. It's like you have to get a certain threshold of training in, and especially if you're someone who's quite experienced, like that goes up over time. But then it can't just be like this thing where like that in of itself is the badge of honor. It's like, no, you have to do like the thing correctly, like train in the way that you need to be training, which again will vary over time, but to put that first, and then it's like, by the way, you're also doing a lot.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's go back to like, for example, if somebody's got a Whoop and they're in the red, and they have the tendency to like freak out, like, oh man, my sleep score was bad last night, like my training's gonna suck today. I feel like that's a pretty common experience for people who have like wearables. Do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, if someone freaks out about it, and let's say they are working with a coach, what I would say is for them not to look at it. So they can share the data with their coach, either if you're on like the same group in the Whoop app or something like that. So the coach can see it, but I would tell them like, hey, just you don't pay attention to it because you're very reactive to it. So a lot of times keeping that data a little bit secret is helpful. And I know like that's the thing that a lot of either strength coaches or sports scientists do if they know that their athlete is very reactive to it or very sensitive to that information. And they're like, sometimes it can get in your head, right? Like they'll be like, oh man, like, oh, my recovery score is 32% today. Like, not like, I kind of feel it now. I kind of feel it, and they were perfectly fine. But if like, maybe sometimes hiding that piece of information, especially during times of like competition or, something important's coming up is probably my like the best way I think to go about it.
Yeah. I mean, if you just gather feedback from athletes, like the results, and you just see them trending badly, like you're not a very good coach if you don't change anything.
Yeah.
But you also don't need to tell the athlete all the time, like, hey, like, it seems like you've just been a little tired recently, and maybe they don't even need like a formal deload. It's just like, hey, let's just pull out some of this extra volume that was somewhere, or change exercise selection or something just a little bit that just kind of allows them to recover a bit, and takes a little bit of pressure off their system. And oftentimes they don't even need to know that. It's like, hey, you just keep doing your thing. I'll adjust it a little bit. And athletes probably don't realize, like, as coaches, again, if you have a good coach who cares, like, they're gonna alter training at least a little bit at times, based on just subjective feedback as well. So it would be no different for, I guess, objective. It's just like, because it's objective, it has this very clear number that's associated with it, and then those are bad numbers, quote bad numbers, right? Even though like there's gonna be times where you like intentionally maybe not think about driving them down, but they're thinking about driving fitness qualities, but ultimately it's gonna have to start with the I don't know what you call that, downward, fatigue rises as fitness is improving, and then until fatigue clears up, you're going to be in a hurt for a little bit.
Right. And like, I was describing this to someone recently where it's like, think about when someone is working out really hard and they take, let's say they have a vacation coming up, they take a week off, right? Or they do just like some type of hotel workout. Mostly with the dumbbells and everything, you're not going to be able to do like heavy squats or heavy deadlifts and benching and all that. So you're pretty limited. But it ends up being like this active recovery. And when they get back, they actually, not always, so I'm not going to use the term always, but many people feel better and they end up feeling stronger. And that's because that recovery time allowed for that fatigue to kind of dissipate and that fitness to reveal itself.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically tapering. Like, people normally feel, especially people who haven't done tapers before, like newer athletes who the competing process, especially in a traditional sport where it is going to be like, you kind of like, for example, like triathlon, like you probably, building a lot of volume up and relatively close to the event. You also are getting up plenty of intensity as you're approaching, and then it's like you start to really pull out the volume, and then that's when people actually feel good. Whereas like in the lead up to the event, people often feel really beat up and just like tired all the time, like not crisp at all. And then it's like when you go to pull that out, that's when you feel really good. So
yeah, actually that's interesting, because like one thing with tapering was, this came up through conversation and through my own Whoop data, but with the swim team, it was during their tapering time last year, and a lot of them were telling me something about the tapering blues. So it's like, during taper, like we just feel really depressed and like we don't feel great. And you would think we would feel great because we're not swimming as much and we're not doing as much load activity. And they're like, and we don't know why. But then eventually once game time comes, like we feel good. but like during like that week leading up to it, like they were just saying they call it the tapering blues. And so then when I did like a little deload, I went through like a period of like high intensity, a lot of volume. It was like earlier this year. And then when I took a deload, my Whoop data was really low. Like HRV was high, HRV was low, resting heart rate was high. And I thought it was weird because I'm like, I should be feeling pretty good. I took this sports science course and all that. And one thing they mentioned was that typically during tapering periods, like the data actually is very conflicting. And they don't know why. There's not enough research to back it up. But usually you see the opposite effects where you think you will see resting heart rate slowly go down and the HRV go up and recovery scores look good and let's say like their performance goes up, but you actually see it go the opposite direction and it causes people to freak out, but you have to wait till the tail end of tapering, usually during game time, to see it, the numbers and the data go your way. So it's like most of tapering, you're actually seeing like the opposite. And they don't know if it's because like a homeostasis shift, like the body's used to doing all this work and you're taking it all away. So it's kind of recalibrating in a way. Eventually it gets used to it and it's like, oh, and then it goes that right direction. So I thought it was an interesting thing.
Yeah, it is interesting. I don't necessarily can't explain the physiological markers side of it, but from like a psychological standpoint, it's like it's almost like, oh, like for me at least, it's like, oh man, thank goodness I made it to like my taper, or it's like now I don't have to like beat myself into the ground every day. But then it's like when you're not getting, like you feel so altered after training that it's like, for better or for worse, people become kind of either addicted to that or just like that becomes part of like their normal circadian rhythm almost. Like we practice at this time, I swim 5K in the pool at this time, and it's like if you don't get that, then it like really alters like your mood. And then it's a combination of like I'm not at the I haven't gotten to the finish line, well technically the start line. Like I haven't gotten to my game time yet, and it's also like I'm not getting that normal like boost in circadian or boost in like mood and like that the normal circadian rhythm. That would be, I don't know, that's my guess.
Yeah, definitely on the mental side, especially with like CrossFit athletes, like you were saying, triathlon athletes or endurance sports where they do so much work, right? I feel like most of the time like they become addicted to this work.
Yeah, you have to have a little bit of disorder.
Yeah, right. It's not
for any of those sports. I mean, gosh, to stare at a
Right.
black line in the bottom of a pool for like hours a day and do that for years and years.
Yeah,
I know. You have a problem.
Yeah, there's definitely something
in the best
going
way,
on.
but
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. One of the things that you mentioned, so you use HRV, resting heart rate, or HRV and resting heart rate a lot. You mentioned the subjective markers like people's just subjective stress levels, their mood, their training quality, things like that. What other things do you use at the school that you kind of have access to that maybe other people don't have that you've been able to use that you've found value in?
Yeah, that's where like working in professional or college sports where there's some money is kind of fun because there's like access to technologies that you don't normally have, working at a commercial gym or in smaller sports or anything. So the two big ones that I use, I would say it's force plates, and I could get into what force plates are, and GPS IMU technology. So, and I'll get into details of what that is as well. So with force plates, I always tell everyone it's just basically this metal slab that we have, right? Just you see it on the floor and it's just like, all right, cool. It doesn't look like much. Essentially what we do is we have athletes stand on it and do different movements. One of them is a counter movement, jumps with their hands on their hips. They're just standing there and they're jumping up as high as they can. They do about 3 repetitions of that. And from those 3 jumps, we end up getting a ton of metric and data from it. which is kind of cool. It's very simple test. That's not fatiguing at all. And we get things like power output. We get asymmetries and imbalances. We get, time, flight time. So we could get like estimates on jump height. And we can use those for a lot of different things, those pieces of information. So that's really cool. And we use that across all teams just because it's easy to test, and you could do it a reoccurring test like weekly, monthly, or whatever if you're trying to get fatigue monitoring or performance improvements or progressions. So force plates, and then we have I use something called Connexon, which is IMUs, inertial measurement units. And what those are is basically this chip, and I use it with the volleyball team. So this chip, they put it in their sports bra, and it basically measures all these different things like the amount of distance covered over their practice, the jumps, the overall load, which is basically in the Connexon company has like their own algorithm to calculate the load. So load, it looks at accelerations. We also look at exertions. So you can get all these pieces of information. They also use it for the basketball team as well, but I don't work with the basketball team, so I don't know how they use their data. But just gathering all those pieces of information, you could get a lot based on what the athlete is doing and all that, and correlate the data as well.
So for like GPS, what's a sign that someone is in a bad recovery place?
Yeah, that one, that takes time to accumulate data. So like we spent a year accumulating data just to get baselines. Baseline as a team, baseline per position, and baseline per player. So now I know what the normal amount, standard deviation, and variation for each player is. Like, hey, this athlete, the average jumps that they have in practice and in a game is this much, and this is how much it varies. And now when we use that information, I download it right away after their practice or their game, and I look at it and I'm like, oh, okay, they did way less work than they normally do, or they did way more work. Oh, that makes sense because look at their force plate data. Their force plate data, they're showing their jump height was significantly lower, and they were jumping a lot more. So they're probably just fatigued, and that was reflected in the force plates. And so that's kind of how we look at it. We correlate the data and look at the whole picture, just because it's hard to get like a holistic picture from one technology or one metric. So we try to kind of correlate all of it. And it actually correlates pretty well.
So do people generally move less if they're tired?
Yeah. So we've seen that is like, for example, move less or move differently. Like with the force plates, when they're tired, you can see that their jumping strategy changes. So they, especially with like athletes, they know how to move their body pretty well to kind of compensate for the fact that fatigue is there. So they'll still try to get the same amount of jump height and try to mask the fatigue. So if I'm looking at the jump height metric, I'm like, like they're super fatigued. They're telling me they're fatigued. They're not lifting as much weight as they normally do, but their jump height is still normal. There's this other metric that kind of shows you. It's called RSI mod. I'm not going to get into details about it, but basically what it does, it shows you the jump height divided by another number, and it'll see like, oh, hey, like they were able to get the jump height, but this number masked the fact that they changed it, that they were able to compensate.
You're just cueing the athletes to like jump as high as they can, basically, and then based on how they jump is where you're actually looking versus the height.
Right. So we're looking at the height, but we also look at the other metric as well to see if they're somehow changing their jumping strategy to mask it.
Gotcha.
And that metric is really good at telling us like if there's underlying fatigue that they're somehow hiding in their jumping height. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the most important things that you said before about the force plates was like that you want to be able to do it like regularly. Like it's kind of useless to collect data like one time if you don't have like this reoccurring loop of like it's like a check-in. Like you do it every so often to know where you're at compared to where you're at before.
Right.
So it's like if whatever it is isn't practical for you, then it's like not very useful because you want to keep coming back to it. So it's like even there's, for example, like I've heard people say like, oh, like, like a 1 rep max power clean is a great look at readiness. It's like, are you going to do that like twice a week? Like have a person build to a max power clean just to see if their like nervous system is ready? Like, no.
Right. That's a
Not a
horrible.
chance.
Yeah.
It's like I'll do that one time and then like never want to see it again in my programming for who knows how long. So it's like it's got to be something that like is very repeatable, like you said. I'm also curious, like, do you give people any instructions on warm-ups? Do you do warm-ups for that? Is it standardized somehow?
Yeah.
Like what's
So
maybe the entry to that look like?
yeah, so with technology, like some like force plates, it's still really new to the whole field. So people are still trying to find what best practices are. But one of the best practices is to try to keep everything as consistent as possible. So if I'm testing someone and I'm trying to get baseline numbers and all that, the force plate is very sensitive and can detect things. So you want to keep all variables as consistent as possible to see those trends and make sure the trends are accurate. So things like I make sure to have same or similar warm up every time. I make sure to do it like on the same day of the week at the same time. So if I know I'm seeing one team every Monday afternoon, I see them Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I tested it up on Monday afternoon, I'm going to continue testing them on Monday afternoon. And also testing them either under the conditions that you want to see them in. So if you want to test them like after the lift, after the session to see how their jumps are under fatigue, you can do that. If you want to have their most accurate representation of their max effort attempts, then you want to do it before the session starts, after the warm up. So just making sure there's consistency in those variables.
Yeah, I'm picturing someone like doing like a jump at like 6 a.m. when they roll out of bed.
Right.
Versus
No.
like doing like a nervous system warm up at like 3 p.m. and then going into the jumps. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
It makes a huge difference. Like I've seen like athletes where their trends are like all jacked up, and then I look at it and I'm like, oh yeah, so we took their jumps one day, like Monday afternoon, and then they're doing it again on Thursday morning, like after a full week of school and practice, early in the morning, probably little sleep because they're a college student. Like it's not going to be accurate at all. You can't compare oranges to apples.
Are there any other like practical tools that you'd recommend for everyday like gym goers or athletes?
Yeah, the best thing, like I like the Whoop, and if you're consistent with it, it's good. But you can't live and die by it, right? You have to take it very sparingly. But if you want as much information as you can get, then definitely that's the way to go. So there's that. But subjective measurement and just being like tracking things, right? Like you can't track progress without looking at the details. So like tracking the weights that you're using, looking at it over time, subjective measurements like RPEs and all that. Because one thing with RPEs that, the argument against them is that everyone has a different RPE. And I like heard an example recently where it's like someone was saying like, hey, if you're asking like a wrestler to go RPE 9, that's going to look very different than an RPE 9 of an average gym goer. Because like wrestlers know how to push that limit, right? Like they're basically fighting for their life. So RPE 10 to them is like losing a limb. And meanwhile, like RPE 10 to someone else is like, oh wow, like I had to grunt when I did a squat. So it's very different. So, getting that data so then we know what's normal for you over time is extremely helpful as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, I could go on a whole rant on that itself. 'Cause I use RPE a lot in training. I'll use percentages sometimes, but I use RPE quite a bit for both strength work and for conditioning stuff. And it's most of the time it's good because it accounts for just basically like it meets the person where they're at on that day, where it's like if you're tired RPE is going to account for that. Whereas like your percentages aren't going to move, your RPE will be different, right? So it's like, if your back squats are supposed to be at RPE 7, that could be 30 pounds off what it was last week versus this week, just because you're carrying more fatigue or something. So like obviously like that can be a good thing, but then there's gonna be certain people who just, like you said, like never really understand like where they can push, and there's gonna be other athletes who tend to overshoot.
Definitely.
However, maybe this is just my bias because I do use RPE a lot. It's like for more experienced athletes, they become more in tune with that, and if they are fresh, I'm okay with them kind of overshooting that RPE a little bit more. And if they're a little bit tired, and maybe they just don't want to push quite to that RPE, they maybe didn't need to push quite to that RPE. So it's almost like it self-selects for the right thing. And then for people who are more beginner, I usually do prescribe them a little bit more aggressive RPEs, knowing that they're not going to dig themselves in a huge hole, because either they'll just come out of it quicker, or they're just not moving as, absolute loads, or maybe just not training as much. Like they don't have that many sessions in a week, so it doesn't really matter if they're a little bit more beat up, and they'll, again, maybe just doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but when you're a novice, you respond to almost anything well. So it in many ways, it doesn't matter that much.
Right. And like, because I'm like you, like I'm a big fan of RPE. I use it a lot. I program it a lot for my athletes. I think it's really useful, especially for the auto-regulation ways that you were mentioning. So definitely, like, that's one thing I would recommend. And because I like it so much is why I like people to track it, so that we can get an established, like, okay, this is normally, like, if you're doing a 1 rep max, like, and you're saying it's a RPE 7, okay, now I know how you operate a little bit more. Also, another thing too is tracking it over time, like the RPE of a session. Like if the RPE of a session is 10 out of 10, or very high numbers for long, like days at a time, so it's like, okay, like you understand a little bit more, and you could kind of make smart decisions from there.
Yeah, that could probably be something I could add, is like for my own coaching. It's like I have people track their training quality, but I rarely have people report on like just how hard the session was. I mean, part of it is like typically I know, but there's other times too where it's like, you wrote this EMOM for somebody, and by nature it's going to have a defined amount of work, and the rest is going to be variable based on how long it takes them to get through it. And it's like, wow, they were almost bleeding into the next minute by the time they got to minute 12 of this 15-minute EMOM, and it was like max effort. And I thought it was just going to be sort of like a solid warm-up or something, right? Like, to be extreme with it. It's like, if that's the case, then it would be really helpful to know that. And if they're doing that, and again, hopefully they tell me that in their notes, and that's maybe one way around it, but to have that extra layer of like, hey, the entire session here, like this was like a high effort session. It's like another way for you to see, like you kind of said before, like you use like sort of a high, moderate, low type structuring to sessions. That way you can say like, oh, I thought this was going to be a moderate session. It actually ended up being a hard session based on either just, where I thought you'd be, like my interpretation of your fitness versus where you're actually at, or just based on like your own readiness. Today you were a little bit tired, so it was a higher RPE across that entire session.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I know when I program for athletes, like on the Excel sheet, it'll say like high, low, blah, 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 based on what I want. And so then after, like, once they fill it out, I could see like, oh, that didn't match up, or okay, good, it matched up. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing too is like, I'll let you go here, but I think if it allows someone to mentally prepare a little bit. Like you don't have to be in the same mental state to go into a low session versus a moderate session versus like an intense session. Like to gear up mentally for an intense session multiple times a week can be really daunting, but also like necessary, and like to a degree, like you need to know that it's going to be challenging to be adequately able to prepare yourself, like mentally and physically, for what you're about to do.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well, yeah. If people got questions about like specific technologies or like other things that they want to see, yeah, you kind of mentioned that maybe you'd bring it up on Fitness Daily at some point in your podcast, but yeah, reach out today and she can answer your questions.
Yeah. I love talking about it, so just be prepared.
You're in the right profession, Day.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.